Well, Sky, thank you so much for taking time for this. I'm so happy to see you again. I know we connected a few months back. It seems so much has changed. It seems like COVID has receded a little bit, and people are happy to convene in groups. I just came back from Black Hat, and before that, RSA, and I was so happy to see so many friends and so many people that I used to connect over Zoom and meet them face to face. And but the bad guys are not sleeping either. So with the threat landscape ever changing, I know last time we discussed your views on what top three challenges, current and future, you see will face CISOs. What has changed recently? What are you seeing? What do you think 6 months from now, 12 months from now? What some of the existing or maybe emerging challenges will be top of mind for CISOs?
Well, it still continues. I mean, for me, the advanced persistent threat, or APTs are still, they're increasing in pool, and the ability to execute those, as they're more offensive, right? They're that's a real problem. They're more offensive. Those continue to be, a huge problem. And I don't see those kind of moving away from the landscape because they're too effective, for the scale of damage they're able to create, or the chaos they're able to create. The monetary cost or the investment in terms of human resources is pretty low. So, they're a weapon of choice
And so
for
it
not
sounds like
just,
it's asymmetrical impact,
it
right?
is.
But is it because of that? Do you see that as more kind of state-sponsored attacks like North Korea, Iran, Russia, Eastern Europe in general, China, or do you see because of the low cost, it's actually criminal groups that go after kind of ransomware bounties and attacking kind of low-hanging fruit, or maybe both?
Yeah, no, I agree. So that's exactly what you just stated, exactly the technique that's being used. Basically, if you're, if a good example, Double Dragon, if you look at that, it's basically, it's a hybridized state versus private entity, criminal organization where there's ties to the state, but what you're looking at is basically it's a sophisticated rule of, way of engaging because it takes you out of the realm of, the rules of engagement that we would consider, or ethics. There's no ethical ties there. It moves them beyond that because they're able to do that. They're able to, move more freely. And that's what makes it very difficult. So it's a hybrid type of war, and that's what makes it very difficult.
I see. So that's one. And what kind of what are kind of the runner-ups, the number two and number three?
I would still say ransomware because it's still so effective. And, we would like to say that our response to ransomware is standardized across, a lot of different industries. It's not, it's still, ultimately ransomware, based on, cryptographic, mechanisms, they basically still very effective and causes either long-term or short-term damage. I think generally short-term, but enough to, if you're able to, if you fall victim to ransomware, your company, if you're going to take a hit financially, basically, and depending on the extent of it, what you do, what products and services you're involved in, that's going to drive, I guess the net effect of the ransomware. And then, thirdly, I would say, the changing geopolitical arena. I didn't really, mention that before, but I just think, things that are approaching, every major country on the planet's having, some level of turmoil. I think greater because of COVID, we're seeing a different level of turmoil. We're still in the post-COVID world technically, but, we're still responding to the, basically, the after effects of it, having, the supply chain disrupted so severely, that leaves that very vulnerable. And because of that, that's open to cyber attack. It's more vulnerable to cyber attack. In other words, since it's already been disrupted, we already have, there's a lot of gaps there. There's a lot of, I don't like to call them inefficiencies because the only reason why you could call them that, I guess, they're more vulnerabilities, I suppose, vulnerabilities, they're being exposed to a greater extent because of the supply chain disruption. And that's, I think, occurring pretty much every sector that we see.
I see. Well, and kind of to double click on a little bit on the first aspect that you mentioned, the advanced persistent threats. How do you see this playing out? It just the up until now, the whole world was so interconnected. It seems like TikTok is giving Facebook and Instagram and Twitter the run for the money, and it's a Chinese company. I just saw an article the other day that uh, a huge percentage, a huge share of the drones, commercial and private, are made in China as well. And it's just a functionality, capacity to take imagery at scale, and God knows what kind of software they're running. So it seems like some of those chains that were linked, it seems like this trend towards globalization, it seems like it's swinging back. So do you see that those countries, at least the ones who can afford it, do you think they'll be going kind of more into more a siloed mode where they will try to wean themselves from providers, either hardware or software or both, and try to create all that in-house closed loop systems, therefore limiting potential access and potential exposure to those APTs? Or you think it's the ship has sailed and there is no real defense against something like this?
Well, that's a good question. That's also a really tough one because the majority of the manufacturing base for, for ICs, integrated electronic, integrated circuits or integrated electronics, or microprocessors, we have the huge presence in, Taiwan. And, of course, the manufacturing base for a lot of our smart devices is the same. So we've seen that hit the automotive industry really heavily. We've seen it hit not just that, but other types of transportation. And when I say that automotive industry, I'm just talking about, the consumer automotive, not necessarily the commercial, but there are other types of transportation. They're still motor driven, right? That we don't think about really, more in the commercial sector. We don't think about on a daily basis that they've been, they're a part of the industrial base and the industrial control systems, and a lot of them are partially robotic, even though they're motor driven, using petroleum based products. They're also robotic. Those have been affected. So, do I see us I do see us trying to get a grip on it. And like we've looked at, you see that, the military has, I think, the most, not just a formal framework, but the most, I don't like to say closed system, but I would say the most guarded system, the military industrial defense industrial base, and they've tried to, their supply chain mechanisms, are really well vetted, but we've also introduced CMMC, as that now 2.0, right? And using that maturity model, basically trying to give a higher level of vetting to the supply chain. I don't know. There's no easy answers here. I mean, the truth is, I really don't, because, the different sectors would have different pathways ahead, in terms of looking at the manufacturing becoming more siloed. I mean, if you look at financial industry or fintech, since they're fully integrated across pretty much everything, because it's the way we transact finance, they have different answers in every different country, especially if they're central bank driven, all the member banks that subscribe to the federated banks that are central bank driven. I think that things like aircraft, we'll see probably that start to change, becoming more siloed. Even the civilian aircraft, even though, companies like Airbus, I mean, they're NATO, countries. So if you're looking at things like consumer electronics, like drones, which, okay, drones are UAS, they have a vast span, you can, from the very, like a simple toy that a child would use, or to do anything with, to something that's highly complex, that's an industrial drone that go into the multiple tens of thousands or even more, dollars, or even to the military grade. General Atomics is a good example of that, and they're out of Silicon Valley. General Atomics, they have that relationship with the military and the defense industrial base that's really, really well vetted and really well, tightly, controlled. Those are military grade drones. I mean, they're weapons, or technically they're cyber weapons if you think about it, because the entire control mechanism is through the cyber domain. So I know that's kind of that's not really an answer, but I just think that's a really, it's a question that's so wide and vast that I think depends on whatever verticals you're in, and then also what horizontal integration you have.
And
That's
some
gonna,
industries probably more suited than others. If you're just moving ones and zeros, that's one kind of set of challenges. If you're actually
right.
physical goods or people, it's different. And also, you provided perspective, but you mentioned Taiwan, which is actually pretty good example, because 60 or 70%, maybe even more, of semiconductors in the world is made in Taiwan, and it's
Right.
right next to China, and China wants to lay claims of it. And I think that's kind of part of the reason why recently it was announced that a multi-billion-dollar investment in a local production, but it will take years to build this kind of functionality, this kind of facility. And interim, I mean, it's a sign that the things are swinging in the other direction from globalization to being more siloed, but it's going to take time. And interim, this transition period, it's certainly, some industries will be more exposed than others. And kind of to follow this conversation, if we double click on the second challenge that you mentioned, the ransomware, do you see a solution kind of in the works? And the end of the day, is it just a matter of keeping a parallel system and backup? So if your current system get bricked by ransomware, it can flip the switch, restore the backup, and keep running, or you think it's more the vector is more kind of educating your employees and running simulations, making sure that they don't click on suspicious links and they don't open or forward emails. Like, what do you see it something that will get resolved at some point, either with technology or training, or you think it will continue to be a major challenge in months and maybe even years to come?
Well, I mean, that's a good question too, because that's a two-tiered approach. I mean, education and training, that's really, really, really important. But, that would affect preventative measures, I mean, so, of course, your goal is to prevent. If you could really prevent everything, that would be fantastic. If you could prevent all of it. But I mean, I know, we know that's not realistic. So, the response to, a breach, or the response to, ransomware, you know, or your company, falling victim to ransomware, that's really important, especially depending on what you do for a business. How critical is an outage to you, both in information, and what product or service, are you dealing with, and there's cyber insurance, but it can be expensive. And I don't like to, go down that road too far either, because it's not a good option for everyone, especially small businesses. Maybe they can't afford it. Maybe, budgetarily it's not, the risk isn't, outsourcing the risk for that financial type of investment is not feasible. I think that education and training is really important, and that will definitely decrease ransomware attacks, not attacks, but the actual execution. The attacks will probably continue to spin up, get further. But I think that it has to be both. In a simple answer, you have to do both. But I guess you have to take a measured approach. But I think it's, financially pretty achievable to just increase your education and training, especially small companies. I think you could, awareness is important, I think.
But do you see a technological solution that will either mitigate or completely solve the issue of that particular attack?
Well, I mean, you know, I have information. There's certain, I can't use any names, but certain of my counterparts in the U.S. government, are kind of moving away from blockchain because of the execution scale and the level of difficulty it would take to implement it, and going towards other things, other technologies. But I think for a lot of businesses, blockchain could be a viable, especially small, it could be a viable way to prevent that. Or you have to, if you have viable attribution, somehow have viable attribution, you know, going on where you can really validate and verify, whatever's going on in your company. I mean, zero trust, right? That's supposed to address this. And if we start moving towards ZTA, which the federal government really doesn't have a choice. I mean, they've been mandated to do that through the executive order, right? That was signed by President Biden. Uh, in order to do that, you have to move towards that type of architecture, which is, you know, never trust and always verify instead of, it's basically always verify. And yeah, sure. I think that would definitely, I don't know, wouldn't, it's not 100%, but it definitely would decrease it severely if we move towards that type of model.
Hmm. And you mentioned the third one, geopolitics. It sounds like maybe, and I can't really tell if it's newspapers are getting more desperate for views and clicks, and they're making headlines more and more dramatic, like end of the day kind of dramatic, or it's really just a reflection of the state of the world where the times of abundance and calm are behind us, because it seems like anywhere you look, internally, abroad, Europe, Ukraine conflict, China and Taiwan, it's getting more and more heated, and it scares me. I mean, I have a family to think of, and friends, um, so, and it seems like, unlike, I don't know, 50 years ago, 100 years ago, the conflict, there are so many facets to the engagement. It's the propaganda wars through social media, it's the cyber attacks, and kind of the physical confrontation. So it's multi-pronged um, engagement. So do you see this kind of persisting in the future and getting worse? Are there solutions to this? How do you see this playing out again in the next 6 to 12 months?
I think that, they'll they're going to evolve, they're going to change, but because this is cognitive warfare now that we're in, it's no longer, and a lot of people, because of, the nature of, I think, life and just how they're exposed to this, may not look at it that way or process it that way. This is a battle of cognition, is the cognitive battle space. So now, it's kind of moved from, we have kinetic warfare, but since they're moving at the speed of electrons now, the speed of, the brain or thought, you're getting closer to that. At least it's not truly at that, paradigm, but you're having, things, where utilizing social media primarily is, one of the ways they're doing it. There's other ways that they're doing it, but things like Twitter, which enables vast, basically a vast span of attack. There's a huge attack vector with Twitter because, any user could be exposed to that one tweet or that information. And so any way that the way that they're doing that is they're, tweaking things that may not be apparent to the users. They're tweaking, not just algorithms, engagement, the way they engage, the use of hashtags, and they're very, very effective at it. And I think that's going to improve through the use of, technologies that enable people to, increase, basically their cognitive presence. That's going to be through, AI and ML, which is already being done. And how they're doing that is, if you're talking about language, NLP, right? They're using that technology, GPT-3, right?
To arm the attack or to disarm?
So both. So that's the thing. It can go either way. You can use it to, to create false narratives, or to create a narrative. Whether or not it's false is going to be up to, where is that information coming from?
I'm fascinated by the subject because you can choose a word that essentially conveys the same meaning, but it provides a spin and angle, and it totally changes the meaning and the intent of of a headline. And
Correct.
often you see, like taking a nonpartisan approach, sometimes the um, same event, same facts, but just different spin, different choice of words gives a completely different perspective, completely different narrative on both sides of the aisle. So it's for me, it's fascinating and it's interesting. I think there are a lot of parallels. You mentioned cognition. It seems uh, the same, not the same, but as you can infect a computer with a virus, you can infect a mind with an idea virus, something just so captivating and basic, that it's scary because when it's done at scale, it can move people, it can move public opinion, and it can move sentiment. It can move people to action. And it's fascinating that it could be done with technology, and it could be done by people with intentions less than savory. So it's certainly a very, very interesting space. And the same way, I'm very curious about technology that would disarm something like this. So it would flag words that could be inflammatory and swap them for words that just convey facts and not necessarily carry this emotional baggage with them as well.
Yeah, that's the secret. You just revealed the secret. Emotionality. The whole intent is to move it away from logic and into the emotional sphere. And emotional engagement is where it's won, and it's very effective. It really works. If it didn't, then it wouldn't be so effective. It really does, and you see that. So instead of stating, let's say 100 plus 100 is 200, somebody will state, the lack of 100 has caused this many deaths. The lack of 100 is equals 100, and that's shorted. The net impact of that has caused. They'll give you an emotional something, any emotional trigger, and it works. So then you'll see people tweeting, retweeting, or responding. They'll engage immediately. It's like, oh, they'll say, you'll see all these horrific, and
Yeah.
none of them are fact based. They're all emotional.
Well, there's an old saying in the newspaper industry: if it bleeds, it leads, right? So if
Yep, that's correct.
there was a famous meeting in New York Times when they discussed what's going to go on the first page. Uh, well, I think most of it is print is not as important right now as it used to be, but it used to be one of the most important conversations that uh, editors could have in a newspaper, is like what's going to go on the top of the headline, on the top of the first page, because that's kind of the attention grabber. Scott, well, shifting gears a little bit, and kind of going back to the world, going back to kind of meeting face to face. We're at Definia, thinking of some of the ways other than Zoom, other than those CISO wire updates that we send out every week. We're thinking of hosting small scale face to face local events, and we're trying to look at kind of best of breed, whether it's Evanta or maybe Cyber Risk Alliance. There's a handful of various communities. I'm wondering, and we just want to see what works so we can borrow the best ideas kind of from your experience. What some of the other communities you're involved in, and what did you see work in terms of the format, the scope of those events, whether it's social gatherings or sponsored dinners or mini conferences or lunches or what have you. Well, what are your thoughts on that?
I think social events are the best way to do it. I mean, of course, ISC squared, without, I'm very active in ISC squared, especially in the veterans, scholarship arena. I, which of course, the CISSP and all of their certifications that are probably, I mean, to me, yeah, and a lot of folks don't know this, but originally, the CISP was developed for the DoD. That certification, it was, so it tends to have and it has always had a pretty, stellar reputation, and so does ISC squared. So, they have chapter events. I'm not saying that model is the best, but I think that, following, well, geolocation is really important. Of course, it has to be local, and I think that social is good too, because it gives people it kind of lightens the mood and gives people more engaging experience, and they're more likely to share things, more openly than sometimes if it's more of a conference type environment. Sometimes people aren't as, open. If it's more casual, I think that's a great idea, I think.
Okay. Well, we're kind of putting our calendar together for the remainder of the year and probably Q1, Q2 next year. And certainly, if there are events in your area, would love to see you there. I know we're coming up on time, and I'm sure some of our members will want to reach out. What's the best way to connect? Is it LinkedIn, a website? Where do you want people to go to find and engage with you?
Oh yeah, LinkedIn is great. That's my favorite. I get I have to apologize if people are trying to reach me on that, because it's difficult to keep up. But please, if I don't answer first, please be persistent. I will answer you. But yeah, I prefer LinkedIn, and that's it. I think that's it. I have a website, but I prefer LinkedIn.
Awesome.
Because you'll default, you kick you to LinkedIn anyway as my
Right.
preferred.
Excellent. Well, Sky, thank you so much for your time. Again, as I mentioned, as soon as we put our calendar of events together, we'd love to see you kind of attending maybe those, or maybe we can put a panel of sorts together. Would love to have you join. But again, I really appreciate your time. This was awesome.
Thanks, Misha. Please reach out anytime. It's always a great thing. And I enjoy actually the affiliation with PHINIA, and the portal is really great, especially it's actually, I'll tell you this, from what I've seen, is the best in terms of not just advertising jobs, but also kind of keeping a pulse on where people are. It's better than anything I've seen. Because if you go to any of the other portals, it's not as specific as Affinia is. Affinia is very specific, and I really appreciate it. I think you're best in class, to be honest.
Thank you so much. It just made my day.
Yeah,
Thank you. Thanks, Sky. Appreciate it.
you're welcome.